Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is lecture 2 on Aristotle on the soul. In the first lecture, we talked about Aristotle's difference with Plato on form and matter. In this second lecture, we're going to get more into the concept of soul itself. Again, if you have not watched my introduction to Aristotle, you might want to stop this recording and go to my channel and look at the Nicomachean Ethics Part 1, Aristotle. And of course, if you have not watched the previous part of this lecture, Aristotle on Soul Part 1, you would want to stop now and go look at that lecture as well. So last time we talked about form as what makes this body the kind of body it is. It's the organizing principle of this particular body. Now, all of the examples I used in the previous lecture were living examples, but we could also talk about, say, a gold atom or a silver atom as having particular forms, right? So gold, as we know, is organized in a particular way, which makes it a different kind of substance than a silver atom. And those are different kinds of substances from other kinds of atoms that we might talk about. So what makes the kind of form special for living beings is that it is of a living being. So if we want to talk about living beings as distinct from non-living beings, we want to make a distinction in the thing that organizes it to be the way that it is. And Aristotle is going to do that by looking at the form of the thing, and he's going to say that all living things have a specific kind of form, and that kind of form is called the soul. And so in the De Anima, he defines the soul as the primary form of a body with the potential for life. So a gold atom or a silver atom, if you believe in string theory, particular strings, do not have the potential for life, right? Our bodies might be composed of different kinds of chemicals, but by itself, those chemicals do not have the potential for life in any real sense. You're never going to see a gold atom mutate and form into a living human being or a living bear or anything. But our bodies do have the potential for life, right? And presumably right now, I'm speaking to you over this fancy equipment, and I'm a living person. So the thing that organizes my body, that organizes all of the atoms in it to act in a particular way, that organizes all the chemicals in it to act in a particular way, that is the form of my body, and it makes me a specific kind of thing. It makes me a human being or a member of Homo sapiens sapiens. And because I am living, we would call the form that I have, a soul. Um, obviously, some things live, some things don't. That's just true from our everyday experience. And all things, though, all substances have forms. And what we're doing is we're just distinguishing the forms of living things from the forms of non-living things. So the forms of living things are called souls. Well, if we're going to distinguish between things that live and things that do not, how are we going to define life? And so Aristotle takes a fairly simple process here. He says life is something that has self-nutrition and growth. And those of you who've had any kind of biology or even any kind of science class in grade school are going to recognize that as our typical definitions of a living thing. And of course, there are things that are on the boundaries there, so we kind of question whether viruses are living because they don't sort of grow, they don't have self-nutrition in the same way that, say, an amoeba does. But we're going to leave the side cases aside for the moment and just focus on things that we typically take to be living: trees, dogs, amoebas, those sorts of things. So Aristotle goes on to say that living may mean thinking or perceiving, or local movement and rest, or movement in the sense of nutrition, decay, and growth. So what we're talking about here is what we basically mean by life, and all life shares in some sense in nutrition and growth. And so the forms that organize those that have the powers of nutrition and growth are going to be special kinds of forms. We're going to call those souls. So Aristotle goes on to say it is as meaningless as to ask whether the wax and the shape given to it by the stamper one are generally the matter of a thing and that of which it is the matter. For this is to emphasize once again that a soul or form cannot be separated from the matter which we find it in. Uh, so these are intellectual differences, not real differences, we might say. So we can talk about the cat being this kind of thing, cats, and we can associate all cats with each other and classify them, but we're not really talking about something separate from individual cats. And this is an idea that is often lost in biology, but also throughout most of philosophy. And we're never going to talk about matter as not having a particular kind of activity to it, right? Even string theorists are going to say that there are particular kinds of strings. Our quarks have upwardness or downwardness, right? So they have particular forms to them. So the differences that we see are intellectual differences, not real differences. We never find matter by itself, and we never find forms by themselves. So Aristotle is going to say that there are three kinds of souls. Right? A living thing's soul is its capacity to engage in the activities that are characteristic of living things of its natural kind. And what are those activities? So we're going to divide the soul according to the different kinds of activities that we might find in particular living beings. And so just to kind of clue us in here, the three kinds of souls are going to be vegetative, sensitive, and rational. So vegetative souls are going to be concerned primarily with nutrition and growth. Those are the powers of what we typically take of as plants, right? The sensitive soul, we might also call the animal soul, although we don't want to do that because it confuses us on what human beings are, because human beings are animals as well. So the sensitive soul is going to have, in addition to nutrition and growth, the powers of sensation and movement. And then the third kind of souls are rational souls, and they have reason and perceiving. So the most typical answer here of our example of a rational soul would be a human being. But human beings, of course, eat, they have nutrition, they grow, they have sensation, we touch things, and we move about in the world typically. So three different kinds of souls. Vegetative souls can't do all the things that sensitive souls do, and sensitive souls cannot do all the things that rational souls do. But we're talking about different powers in each of these. So what makes individual human beings or individual members of Homo sapiens sapiens different is not the soul, but the matter, right? It's the stuff that separates us in time and space. Okay, so Coco the cat is Coco because she is this cat in this particular spatiotemporal matter, and that's going to be determinative for individuality. So that obviously raises the question about immortality. Aristotle is going to deny immortality, but when we're talking about the soul, particularly in the 20th century or 21st century, we often think about souls having immortality. For Aristotle, that would be nonsense, okay, because souls don't exist by themselves because souls are forms. What exist are substances. So if we were going to talk about immortality, we would have to talk about the substance having an immortality. The soul is not a body, but requires a body, for it is not a body, but it belongs to a body, and for that reason it is present in a body and in this sort of body. For Aristotle, matter individualizes us, but it also exists in time and space, and immortality is something that doesn't exist in time and space. So the idea of an immortal substance makes no sense for Aristotle because a substance is always going to be something that includes. So for Aristotle, while the soul has the possibility of immortality, if it existed by itself, because it doesn't exist by itself, it cannot have immortality. Now, many of you probably know Thomas Aquinas was a scholar of Aristotle, and he built most of his ideas by trying to extend Aristotle's understanding of philosophy and make it part of Christianity. So he shares with Aristotle the conception of soul and of body, and he realizes that uh, form and matter cannot exist separately. So the question then arises, how does Thomas Aquinas reconcile Aristotle's conception of the soul with Christian immortality? For Thomas, he says that things can be corrupted either accidentally or in itself. Now, accidentally here for for Thomas Aquinas does not mean that it's an accident that you ran into the car. What he means is that it's not part of the nature of the thing to be corrupted. So some things are just corrupted not because there's something in themselves that make them corrupt, but because it just happens this way. Okay. So the form or the essence does not have corruption in itself. It's corrupted by something outside of it. Whereas other things are going to be corrupted in themselves. And so we might talk about, for instance, matter as we normally think about it. And we think here about atoms themselves being corrupted because they tend to fall apart and not to hold together. So Thomas making this distinction is going to help him to argue that souls are going to be subsistent. That is, they are not within themselves corruptible. Again, we're not talking here about accidents. We're not talking necessarily about sin. We're talking about whether the soul is in its nature something that tends towards entropy. That would be a modern way of saying it. And for Thomas Aquinas, the rational soul is not aimed toward entropy because it has the capacity for reason, the capacity for knowledge, and knowledge is eternal. Now, there's a lot that goes into this kind of argument here, and we're not going to get into that kind of discussion. But what Thomas wants to do is say, because the soul has the capacity for knowledge, it can exist in a subsistent way. And the problem would be how to sustain its existence without the body. Now, of course, Thomas Aquinas has something. We're going to skip this slide. Thomas Aquinas has something that Aristotle didn't, which is God. Sorry, I'm skipping around slides here. Because individuality is based on materiality. Sorry, that's skipping a slide there. Let's go back just a second. Because the soul is an active part of the body, we know that it has an essence. Its essence is to act, and so God can maintain its act apart from the body. But it does so unnaturally. This is Thomas's own words, that the soul separated from the body is unnatural and that it requires a body. So God is not going to do this for a long time. And in fact, what we learn if you're Catholic and you read the New Testament is that we're promised a resurrection of the body. Now, I would criticize Thomas's account here because the question arises, well, what is God maintaining if he maintains our soul separately from our bodies? There's nothing to distinguish my soul from your soul because it's the kind of thing that we are, right? It's Homo sapiens sapiens. So there's nothing there that individualizes us. If we want to maintain that God resurrects the body, there's nothing to stop us from saying that it's done immediately upon our death. Obviously, there would be no scientific evidence of this, but there's no scientific evidence of immortality anyway. That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. What it means is that we're at the limits of philosophy in addressing that question. What Aristotle does for us is he avoids the kind of dualism that we get with Plato and that we get with Descartes, which leads into all kinds of problems. And he satisfies for us how we distinguish individual beings from each other and how we distinguish kinds of beings from each other. In distinguishing living souls from other forms, however, he does something that's kind of unique and that most people forget, and that is, for Aristotle, all living things, whether we're talking about amoebas or trees or cats, have a soul. And so that's something important to remember in relationship to what members of Homo sapiens sapiens are. We are animals. We are living beings that have a particular kind of form that give us certain kinds of powers. But in the end, a form is what unites all things into the kind, or organizes all things into the kind of beings they are.